Texas Monthly.
Hi, it's Katie Vine, the host of The Problem with Eric. Because you follow Texas Monthly's true crime audio storytelling, I wanted to share the latest episode of another podcast I host for the magazine. It's called TM Out Loud, and every week on the show, we take listeners behind the scenes of a major news story in Texas Monthly. This week, we're talking about a big break in a notorious Texas cold case, the 1991 yogurt shop murders in Austin. After 34 years, authorities just announced a DNA match they say finally points to a killer. TM Out Loud is usually exclusive to Texas Monthly audio subscribers, but we're sharing this one with you now. If you want to hear more, consider becoming a subscriber. You'll get a new episode of TM Out Loud every week, plus bonus episodes and early access to other new narrative podcasts. Visit texasmonthly.com/audio to sign up. So, Mike, you were at Austin City Hall this morning for the press conference. I was watching it online. It seemed very intense. Can you lay out the latest developments? What were they saying happened?
Yeah, so it was in the big room at City Hall. It was jam-packed. There were more than 100 people in there, a bunch of cops, a bunch of city officials, the mayor. I didn't realize how many people had worked on this over the last 10 years. I mean, there were people from South Carolina, Kentucky, Texas Rangers. There were a lot of guys with cowboy hats.
Yeah. And I imagine a bunch of people who are retired now.
Yeah.
Right, who used to work on it and worked on it for...
Exactly. There were cops in the audience who had worked on the case. And then right after 10, all the city officials came out, and then all the family members came out, the family members of the girls, who have all become, pretty well known here in Austin over the last 34 years, the parents and the siblings of the murdered girls. There was nobody from the boys' families, as was expected. But I've never seen so many people on a stage for a press conference before. I mean, there were probably 20 people up there.
Can I ask you, why was it expected that the boys wouldn't have anybody speaking for them?
Well, the boys have pretty much been, this case in some ways really divides the city. If you talk to just about any cop or anybody in the DA's office over the last 30, 34 years, they're going to tell you they think the boys did it because they said they did it, because two of them confessed.
And just for anybody who doesn't know this case inside out as you do, what did they confess to doing?
Want me to go back and just lay this out real quick?
Yeah.
So back in December 1991, 4 teenage girls were sexually assaulted and murdered and set on fire in a yogurt shop in North Austin. It was just this really terrible, terrible crime that really shook the city at the time. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happened in New York or L.A. It didn't happen in sleepy Austin, Texas in December 1991. And the city just went crazy trying to solve it. The cops, it was a very small police force. They started a task force. They had hundreds of people confessing. There was very little evidence left over at the crime scene because the killer had killed the 4 girls and then set the whole place on fire. And so the first people who showed up, the first responders, were the fire department. They sprayed the whole place down. Oops, they found the bodies. By then, all the evidence was gone. So the cops were overwhelmed from the get-go. I mean, there were only 5 or 6 Austin police detectives at the time.
God.
So they had to do the whole thing. They brought in a task force, and pretty soon, task force was found to have been coercing confessions out of people. Other people were confessing because they wanted the publicity. It was just a total mess. And 8 years later, in 1999, they arrested these 4 boys, which seemed to be almost too perfect. There were 4 teenage girls. These were 4 young men who had been teenagers back in 1991, and now they were in their 20s. And it turned out that one of them, 8 days after the murders, had been found at North Cross Mall, which is only a couple of blocks away. It's where all the kids hung out. One of them, his name was Maurice Pierce, and was walking around with a .22 with a friend of his named Forrest Wellborn. And a .22 was the murder weapon. So they pulled him in. And then he said that these other 2 boys had been with them that night, Robert Springsteen and Mike Scott. They were just like these kids just messing around, and this terrible thing had happened. The next day, Maurice Pierce took it back, but then the cops went after the other two, Springsteen and Scott, and after marathon interrogations, it was like 18 hours straight, Mike Scott confessed. And then Robert Springsteen, who at the time was living in West Virginia, confessed after, again, a very long interrogation. So all of a sudden we had this kind of poetic, closure. 4 boys had killed the 4 girls. And so that's when I first got involved with this story, when those 4 boys were arrested, because it just seemed a little bit too poetic.
Because your story came out in 2001.
Yeah.
Right?
It was the first story I'd ever worked on here at the magazine where I spent a lot of time. I spent
I remember that.
a whole year on it. For me, it was really intoxicating. Oh, my God. I went to a bunch of hearings. I talked to the families of the girls. I talked to the families of the boys. At least as a journalist, there was such a story here. Didn't really know what the story was, but it was just such a terrible thing that it happened. And so we wound up doing the story in 2001. And in the aftermath of that, 2 of the boys were set free, but the other 2 were found guilty because of their confessions. Well, one, Robert Springsteen, was sent to death row. And the other, Mike Scott, was sent away for life. And through this whole time, there were plenty of people on the other side saying these were obviously bogus confessions. They kept them for hours and hours. Again, there had never been any evidence pointing to these boys. This whole case has happened during the DNA era.
Yeah.
It begins in 1991 when DNA is just beginning to be used in Texas cases. And by the early and mid-aughts, DNA is starting to be used more and more. There's more advanced DNA, there's touch DNA, there's STR DNA. Well, at a certain point, a DNA profile is found in one of the victims, Amy Ayers, and that DNA matches none of the boys. And so finally, the Travis County DA has to let these last 2 go. And so it's like this huge story, and yet it has no ending because there's been no justice. We don't know who the killer is. Nobody was happy. The families of the girls were not happy. And it was like this up and down, up and down, up and down thing. And honestly, I think most people who paid attention to this thought it's never going to be solved. It was like this really, really terrible thing
Really
for
unsatisfying,
the city of Austin.
Right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Margaret Brown,
Yeah.
friend of the magazine,
Yeah.
finished working on a documentary about this. It took her several years.
Yeah.
And
long
it
one.
came out this summer. It was a 4-part documentary. It was fantastic. She wasn't trying to solve it.
Yeah.
What she was trying to show was the incredible trauma, how this affected all these people, not just the families of the girls, but the families of the boys too, and the boys.
And asking the question, not as much who did it, but what is the nature of a coerced confession and how does that change an investigation?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's a really important question.
Absolutely. She did not shy away from that.
Yeah.
So it was a really great documentary. And then
Yeah.
5-6 weeks later, pow.
What was your reaction?
I could not believe it.
I couldn't either.
I was absolutely stunned. I thought there are many great things about the HBO doc, but I remember toward the end of the documentary, there's this great footage of the new head of the cold case unit, a guy named Daniel Jackson. And he says something like, "Oh, we're going to solve this. We're going to solve it, with modern DNA. We're going to do this." And
I think he knew things nobody else knew.
Maybe so.
Yeah, uh-huh. Can you talk about how he laid out in the press conference today what finally went right, how they finally got a hit?
Yeah, so he laid things out really well, and he did not shy away from the fact that they had fixated on a couple of guys who clearly gave confessions that were coerced. Mm-hmm. He didn't back away from that, which I thought was really great. So he came on in 2022, but he did say that back in 2018, they had this profile that had been found, mystery profile. They entered it in CODIS, which is the national database. Everybody thought, well, somebody who did this had to have done something like this before. And CODIS is a database where if you've done an assault or a rape or a murder, they're going to put you in this under the idea that criminals do things more than once. They're going to catch you and do it again. Well, they didn't find anything for this profile. So one of the things that Jackson did was they had found a shell casing in a drain at the yogurt shop. And it was a shell casing from a .380. The girls have been killed with a .22, and I believe Amy had also been shot with a .380. And so they found this casing, and he sends it to this database, and they're like, yeah, let's just try it. And they get a hit out of Kentucky.
Incredible.
And it turns out there's like this unsolved murder that has to do with another family-run store and somebody shot in the back.
And bound, right?
Bound. Mm-hmm. And the whole thing set on fire. And he was like, oh, my God. So there are different kinds of DNA. And one of the kinds of DNA is called YSTR DNA. Men have it. And you can use it to a certain extent to find people in families. And they take this YSTR profile that they found and they enter it manually into all these systems. And lo and behold, there's this South Carolina database where they get a hit. And it's another sexual assault, and it's 1990, and they get a name, Robert Eugene Brashers. And so what they do is they go back to all the other DNA evidence that they have in this case, including the fingernail clippings from Amy Ayers. And they take the DNA from that and they enter it and they connect it with Brashers. And so for the very first time, they actually can show that this is the guy, because Amy Ayers fought back against her assailant and scratched him. And so under her fingernails, there were pieces of her assailant's DNA.
Incredible. What was the reaction in the room when he's talking about this?
It was stunned silence. I kept expecting some outcry or something. You would hear occasionally exclamations, sighs.
Because Brashers is now dead. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in 1999, right? It's not like they can bring him to trial.
Right. And, I think that had something to do with it, just this sense of futility that part of what you want in justice, people want is some kind of you want to catch the bad guy and put him on trial and find out why. And so it was pretty stunning, this kind of freighted quiet. And then the families of the girls got up and talked. Eliza's sister got up. It was so emotional. It was even knowing how emotional it was the last time and the time before that and the time before that. Yeah. And it's not done yet. I mean, they still have to go through this investigation. They're still going to be looking into other things. But watching them go through it again was just gut-wrenching. Just as a parent, seeing that kind of thing. It was, for everybody in the room, it was gut-wrenching.
It sounds like this case changed a lot of detective work, right?
One of the interesting things about it, and the DA, Jose Garza, who is a progressive DA and has made a big deal out of going back with his conviction integrity unit and questioning convictions from this era in particular, and has found other cases where we've seen police extort or attempt to extort confessions out of people. And, even though people know this happens, there is still like this real kind of stubborn pushback on that. People have a really hard time believing that confessions can really be made up. And so hopefully this case will make people realize, no, this is for real. This really does happen. You put people in a certain environment, they're going to confess to something they didn't do, even if it means that they're going to wind up on death row. But, these three surviving, and the posthumous one too, they should clearly all be exonerated. They should clearly get compensation for their time. And, we should really look back at the way we did policing back in the 90s. And I am convinced there are other people in prison who were also intimidated into confessing to things they didn't do.
You've spent a good chunk of your career writing about those cases. Yeah.
There's another guy here in Austin who was recently exonerated. The cops did things differently in the 90s. One of the things we illustrated our story with back in 2001 was a detective holding a gun to Mike Scott's head in 1999. They did things like that, Yeah, things are definitely better now, but we still have people in prison, and not just in Austin. In El Paso, in Dallas, in Houston.
Was this the case that made you want to do more criminal justice investigations? I know you have a background in law and went to law school, but was this the story that kind of pushed you more in that direction?
Oh, absolutely. This was the story where I saw, I think for the first time, just how screwed up a system can be and how that system can make good people do bad things, coerce confessions out of people they might think are guilty, and then feel completely fine about it. And again, I mean, these cops they thought they had the right guys. And so they thought they were doing the right thing. And we're still feeling the effects of it 34 years later.
Well, and what was it like to look around the room this morning after all these years and kind of see the collateral damage around that room?
I really wanted to know what the cops thought. There were like a dozen cops along the walls, and some of them were grizzled cops. They'd been around for a long time. I was really curious to hear what they thought about this.
Yeah.
All the police I've talked to were convinced that these boys did it. Is that different now that we have this DNA? People are just haunted by this.
Is the case closed now?
I don't think it's completely closed. They still have to dot I's and cross T's, and they're going to be looking, they've got the tip line open again, did anybody remember this guy from back in December 1991? And, I think we're going to find more over the next couple of weeks as more things come out about this guy. What was he doing in Texas? Who else did he kill?
Along the way.
If this guy did this and we've just kind of stumbled onto these things by accident, oh my God. I had a sense that everybody in that room was thinking, oh boy, this is not over. This is just starting.
So it's been over 30 years that this happened, 20 years since you wrote about it. Did you ever imagine that there would be this kind of a break in your lifetime? I mean, I don't think there's been another story you've worked on that has been quite this big a break. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, most cases kind of just die out one way or the other. You just never hear about them again. But this was such a huge thing that there was no way that was going to happen. So, yeah, I was completely surprised. Every time they gave an interview, you knew that the city fathers were saying, we got to solve this damn thing.
Because these parents are not going away.
They're not going away.
Yeah.
And they're getting older, but they're still doing the interviews and they're still, they're still hurt and they're still trying to find answers.
Yeah.
And, every time you see those pictures of those four girls, they're 13, 15, 17 forever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What were your feelings on the case back when you were first reporting on it in, I imagine, 2000 with the four potential suspects versus now? Like, is it a different type of story? Is it about something different?
Well, now there really is this night and day moment where I was pretty sure that they hadn't done it, because there's no evidence, and yet, you just... There were so many.
There's always a maybe,
right? There
was
the little girl, who said that Mike Scott told her about all this. And there was just all these things where you were like, there's got to be some truth. You just never know. But now the story is very different. And now, Maurice Pierce is dead, but the other three, they're now in their 50s. So more than half their lives, they have been accused of being brutal murderers. And one of the things that Jackson made a clear point to say is that Brashers was a lone wolf. Everything he did was on his own. There's no way he was working with four teenage boys.
Or at least no evidence
right, there's no evidence
any
of
other,
it.
Yeah.
And so, it's a different story now. And there is going to be a story. These three are going to, especially the two who did time, they are going to fight for legal exoneration, to be found actually innocent. And that is usually a really hard fight. There's a really high bar on doing that. There's going to be no problem with that. The DA is not going to fight it. The cops are not going to fight it. And, they're going to be a sign of what happens when we coerce confessions.
And get tunnel vision, right?
Yeah. And this is a case that tore this city apart. And all of a sudden, 8 years later, you get four boys handed to you as suspects who are confessing. It's like, yes.
Right.
And, it was too good to be true.
I got the sense from watching the press conference that there may be more to come out of this, maybe even nationally, pushing for more money maybe to go into police departments to help pay for uploading DNA into CODIS, that type of thing. Do you feel like there could be more down the line that this could lead to improving the whole infrastructure of detective work?
Maybe. That costs money.
People don't like to spend money.
It would definitely solve a lot of crimes. I mean, one thing I've found is that there's not a whole lot of appetite for going back and resolving old crimes. I mean, for the most part, cops and prosecutors think that the system works and we did it right the first time. And,
Well, it's got to be exhausting to try to relitigate everything you've ever done. Yeah.
One of the things about Texas is, for all of our law and order history, we've also brought out a lot of fantastic reforms in the criminal justice system, from a forensic science commission to we compensate the people who've spent years in prison in a much more generous way than any other state. We've changed our eyewitness lineup procedures. We've done all kinds of really fantastic things. Maybe something like this would go before the legislature, and maybe we would be a state that does something new and innovative. That costs a lot of money, though, so I wouldn't hold my breath.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate you coming in. This has been a huge weekend for everybody who's been following this case, especially those who followed it most closely, the families, the detectives, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on it.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Mike Hall. His piece about the early investigation of the yogurt shop murders, called Under the Gun, ran in the January 2001 issue of Texas Monthly. And one more note, authorities are still looking for information about other cases that might be related. If you know of any crimes that follow this pattern or have information about Robert Eugene Brashers, you can send a note to yogurtshop@austintexas.gov. This episode was produced by Sarah Kinney, Patrick Michaels, and Brian Standifer. We'll be back with more from the pages of Texas Monthly next week.